The graveyard shift at Sacred Heart started like every other night for Margaret Walsh, fluorescent lights humming their electric prayer, the smell of antiseptic cutting through stale coffee, the weight of 3 years of invisibility settling across her shoulders like a familiar coat. She was 58 years old with grey hair she'd stopped colouring on purpose, soft voice she'd trained into cotton, and hands that had forgotten how to tremble somewhere between Bagram and Portland. Nobody looked twice at the nurse restocking the trauma bay supply cart at 2 in the morning. Nobody noticed her reorganizing sterile trays with the precision of someone who'd once held a surgical field together with nothing but muscle memory and will. The wedding ring hung beneath her scrubs on a chain, cool against her sternum. She touched it once, thumb and forefinger, a ritual she performed every time she walked through the automatic doors. 23 years married. 12 years widowed. The army had returned his body in a flag-draped box and his service record in a classified envelope marked "Officially Deceased, Operation Classified, No Further Inquiry." They'd burned the marriage certificate, shredded the deployment photos, and told her in a cold conference room at Walter Reed that speaking about where he died or what he did there would result in federal charges under the Espionage Act. Margaret had nodded. Accepted the medallion they wouldn't let her display. Taken a job in Portland, Oregon, where nobody knew her husband's name or her own rank, where she could wear scrubs instead of dress blues and fade into the infrastructure of a hospital like plumbing nobody thought about. The supply cart wheels squeaked against tile as she moved through the empty corridor. Trauma Bay 1. Trauma Bay 2. Her hands moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd assembled surgical fields under enemy fire, 14-gauge angiocath needles arranged by size, chest seals stacked in order, satin sky clamps laid out like silverware for a dinner party nobody wanted to attend. She caught herself halfway through reorganizing a code cart, had arranged the 4-access line before the airway management, had sequenced everything for combat triage instead of hospital protocol. She stopped. Took a measured breath. Moved the airway kit back to the front. The break room lights were harsh white, the kind that made everyone look like they were already dead. Margaret poured black coffee from the pot that had been sitting since midnight, added nothing, and sat at the far end of the table where no one would think to sit beside her. The chair faced the door. Old habit. She'd trained that out of her voice but not her body. Her body remembered things her mouth had learned to forget. New chief of medicine arrives today, someone said. One of the younger residents, the kind with confidence that hadn't been tested. Supposed to be brilliant. Came from Johns Hopkins. Margaret sipped her coffee and said nothing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects caught in a jar. Someone had written "help" in the steam on the window. Margaret wondered if they meant it or if they were just bored. She finished her shift at 6 in the morning, for hours before most of the hospital woke up, before the corridors filled with residents and attendings and the machinery of organized medicine. The sky was still dark when she walked to her car, a 2008 Civic with 147,000 miles that asked no questions. She'd already changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, had locked away everything that marked her as belonging to the hospital. The ring went back under her shirt. The soft voice went back into its box. For the 8 hours before she returned, she was just a woman who existed without context. But Dr. Marcus Ashford arrived on his second night, a Tuesday graveyard shift, when the hospital was at its thinnest and most vulnerable. Margaret first saw him in the surgical observation gallery, where he was demonstrating a new technique to a cluster of residents who looked at him like he'd invented breathing. He wore a navy suit under his white coat, the kind of suit that signaled money that had been money for multiple generations. His hands moved with the fluidity of someone who had never been told no, and his voice carried the weight of institutional authority that made the younger surgeons straighten their shoulders. The Navy captain on the table had crush injuries from a training accident. Both lungs partially collapsed. Vessels damaged in the chest cavity. A typical trauma that would respond to standard protocols, and Ashford was doing something else entirely. Margaret watched from the corner of the gallery, coffee forgotten in her hands. Her entire body went still. The dual clamp method. The experimental procedure. the one that required understanding not just the anatomy but the mathematics of vessel pressure under systemic failure, the one that required hands that could hold a surgical field open with precision while simultaneously managing the pressure dynamics of a closed system. She had seen this technique exactly 3 times in her life. Once in a PowerPoint presentation at Fort Sam Houston that was immediately classified. Once in a training exercise that was never supposed to happen and was certainly never supposed to be documented. And once in a black site hospital in Bagram, on a civilian woman whose name Margaret was never told, in a room that officially did not exist, where the procedure had failed catastrophically and Margaret had held the woman's hand while she died and there was no paperwork, no chart, no record that any of it had happened. Ashford made the first incision. His hands were steady, surgical, precise. He moved like someone who had rehearsed this 1,000 times, or like someone who had perfected it on bodies that were never supposed to be counted. Margaret's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. She held the position. 2 seconds. 3. In the surgical theatre below, Dr. Ashford's hands continued their work with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing nobody can stop you. But his eyes flicked upward. To the observation gallery. To the corner where a grey-haired nurse in loose scrubs stood frozen. Their eyes met across the glass and distance. His were the color of a winter sky before a storm, cold, clear, calculating. In that single second, his entire demeanor changed. The casual confidence shifted into something sharper, more predatory. He had just seen the face of someone who recognized what he was doing and understood what he was doing and knew things about this technique that she absolutely should not know. Margaret looked away first. She set her coffee cup down on the gallery ledge with careful precision. No sound. No indication that her heart had moved from its steady rhythm into something faster. She turned and walked out of the observation gallery with the same soft, deferential pace she maintained through every corridor of Sacred Heart. Just a grey-haired nurse. Just a woman who mopped spills and restocked carts and made herself so invisible that sometimes she forgot herself. But she could feel his eyes on her back as she descended the stairs. That same night, 3 hours later, a 74-year-old man came into the ER with chest pain and respiratory distress. The monitor showed an arrhythmia that was converting into something worse. Blood pressure dropping. O2 saturation at 86% and falling. A code rhythm that required immediate intervention and the kind of precision that separated the competent from the legends. The resident on duty was new. Good hands, but new. Dr. Ashford was not available. Margaret was in the supply room when the intercom crackled, code blue, Trauma Bay 2. All hands. She didn't run. Running looked panicked. She walked into Trauma Bay 2 with supplies and moved to her position like she'd done this 10,000 times because she had done this 10,000 times, in training, in deployment, in a hospital that nobody was supposed to know existed. The resident was already positioning the defibrillator pads. The intern was drawing up medications. The attending was 3 minutes out. Margaret assessed the patient in the time it took to set down supplies. 60 seconds of observation, the way his chest was moving, the color of his lips, the angle of his head, the pattern of the cardiac monitor showing the electrical chaos in his heart. She'd seen this presentation before. She knew what was coming. She knew what would work. Epinephrine, 1 mg 4, the resident said, his voice steady but slightly rushed. Let's get him back into normal sinus rhythm. Margaret had already assembled the medications, had already calculated the timing, had already projected 3 intervention points ahead. She set the 4 push-up without being asked, and when the chest compressions resumed, her hands were there, not guiding, not leading, just present in the exact right place at the exact right moment when the resident needed something he didn't yet know he needed. 60 seconds. 90 seconds. The monitor showed flat line, then a hesitant blip, then another. 120 seconds. We have a pulse, someone said. BP 72/48. The patient's eyes flickered open. Breathing continued. The attending arrived and took over, and Margaret stepped back into the shadows of the trauma bay like she'd never been there at all, like her hands had not just choreographed every intervention from a position of deference that nobody would ever question. The resident looked at her once, briefly, with the kind of gratitude that was too small for what had just happened. Margaret was already moving toward the door. "Good work in there, Walsh," the attending said, not looking up from the patient. "Just assisting, doctor." That was all she said. That was all she ever said. But her hands had trembled exactly 0 times, and her voice had remained soft as cotton, and nobody in that trauma bay had any idea that they had just watched someone who could have run a surgical field for a SEAL Team Delta operator walk out of the room and return to restocking supplies like it was the most natural thing in the world. Within 48 hours, Margaret Walsh existed in 4 different departments. Monday morning found her restocking crash carts in the surgical ICU, her hands moving with muscle memory through the familiar landscape of ventilators and arterial lines. By afternoon, Dr. Ashford appeared in the hallway with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nurse Walsh, we're going to utilize your versatility. Pediatrics needs coverage starting tonight." She didn't argue. She never argued anymore. Tuesday found her in the oncology ward, learning new computer systems for medication she'd never administered, charting in different formats, building no relationships. Wednesday morning brought another reassignment, back to medical surgical, different floor, same invisibility strategy. Dr. Ashford was systematically preventing her from establishing any pattern, any continuity of care, any position where she might notice inconsistencies in patient outcomes. She understood the strategy instantly. She'd used similar tactics herself in briefing rooms at the Pentagon, fragmenting intelligence to prevent any single person from seeing the complete picture. He was competent. That made him dangerous. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song as Margaret approached the medical records office Thursday afternoon. She needed to verify post-operative status on 3 patients she'd seen recover from what looked like experimental closure techniques. The door to the records terminal opened without resistance. The system prompted for her clearance credentials. She entered her information, waited, and watched the screen flash, access denied, clearance restricted. Contact administrator. She tried again. Same result. Her clearance, which had been unrestricted for 3 years, had been revised that morning. Specific restrictions now applied: no surgical records, no post-operative outcomes, no procedure documentation. Nothing that would let her cross-reference his work, track his patterns, verify her suspicions. A junior clerk at the desk pretended not to notice her standing motionless at the terminal. Margaret could feel the weight of institutional machinery shifting, Dr. Ashford's hands moving every lever, every door closing one by one. That same afternoon, she was assigned to room 347. Mr. Peterson, 72, diabetic, kidney function declining. The contrast-enhanced CT scan was scheduled for 3 o'clock. Margaret reviewed his chart, and her hand stilled over the keyboard. Creatinine rising, eGFR dropping. A contrast scan in a kidney patient already experiencing decline could be catastrophic. She flagged the concern in the system, documented it clearly, and when the transport team arrived to wheel him down, she spoke directly to the resident. "His kidney numbers are deteriorating. A contrast load might push him into acute failure." The resident, a nervous third year named Morrison, hesitated. "I'll mention it to Dr. Ashford." Margaret nodded and returned to the medication cart. 3 minutes later, Dr. Ashford's voice carried down the corridor like a blade. "Nurse Walsh. Conference room. Now." The room wasn't a conference room. It was Mr. Peterson's room, his wife sitting rigid in the corner chair. Dr. Ashford stood at the foot of the bed, his presence taking up all the oxygen in that small space, shoulders back, chin elevated, the posture of a man who had never been questioned and did not intend to begin. "You are a technician," he said, each word measured and precise as a surgeon's incision. "Not a diagnostician. Your job is to follow physician orders, not to contradict them in front of patients. Your job is not to create alarm where none exists. Your job is to pass medications and take vital signs." He paused, his eyes fixed on her face. "Do you understand, or should I explain in smaller words?" The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Mr. Peterson looked away. His wife's tears began to flow, slow and steady, her hand gripping the blanket as if it were the only solid thing in the world. Margaret stood with her hands at her sides, absorbing each word the way her body had learned to absorb shrapnel impacts in body armor, taking the force, distributing the damage, remaining vertical. One measured breath entered her lungs, then exited. Her left eye burned with the sensation of a single tear forming, gravity pulling it down her cheek in a slow track. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She wiped the tear with the back of her hand, and when her eyes focused again, they met his with the flat clarity of someone who had seen worse. "I understand that patients deserve someone advocating for their safety, doctor," she said. Her voice was soft. It was always soft. That was the genius of it. He was the one who'd raised his voice, and now he looked like the villain even to his own face in the mirror. Someone has to. His jaw tightened. His nostrils flared in a way that suggested he'd been hit with something he couldn't quite name. He turned and left without another word, his footsteps sharp on the tile, echoing down the corridor like a promise of something worse to come. The break room on Friday morning smelled like burnt coffee and the synthetic lemon of industrial cleaner. Margaret placed her lunch bag in the small refrigerator and sat at the corner table, the same table where the unit gathered for brief celebrations and shorter mornings. She was still settling into the chair when she noticed the shift in the room's air pressure. 3 nurses stood near the coffee machine. One of them glanced toward Margaret, made eye contact for approximately 1/3 of a second, then turned to the other 2 and gathered her lunch container. "We're going to eat in the lounge," she said to no one in particular. The 2 others followed. Within 45 seconds, the break room contained only Margaret and the vending machine in the corner, its mechanical hum a lonely companion. She unwrapped her sandwich and took a bite without tasting it. Muscle memory. Autonomic function. Survival. The hum of the machine continued its mechanical song, steady and indifferent as a heart monitor. This happened again Saturday. And again Monday morning, when Dr. Ashford was nowhere to be seen, but his influence permeated every hallway like a gas seeping through sealed doors. Margaret showed up. She worked. She accepted her assignments without comment. She absorbed the absence of conversation the way a sponge accepts water, every interaction a reminder that staying invisible had never actually meant being ignored. Thursday morning, there was a printed notice on the unit bulletin board. White paper, official letterhead, Margaret Walsh's full name in block letters at the top. Written warning for insubordination and conspiracy ideation. Effective immediately. Disciplinary probation. The language was clinical and surgical, each phrase designed to wound precisely without leaving marks on skin. Staff read it as they passed. She watched them read it in the glass reflection of the crash cart, watched the micro-expressions of pity and distance, watched them revise their relationship to her downward from mere colleague to marked thing. One resident lingered slightly too long, and Margaret understood that he was calculating whether association with her endangered his career trajectory. She stood before the bulletin board and read every word, letting each syllable settle into the part of her brain that filed information away for operational analysis. The lettering was crisp. The margins were precise. This document had been prepared with care. This document had been reviewed by hospital legal, approved by administration, scheduled for maximum visibility. This document was a professional execution. One measured breath filled her lungs. Her vision remained steady, her hands at her sides. Another tear escaped down her left cheek, and she reached up slowly to wipe it away without breaking her gaze from the paper. She turned to find Dr. Ashford watching from his office doorway, maybe 10 feet away, his expression calculating whether she would cry, whether she would crumble, whether her carefully maintained composure would finally fracture under the weight of institutional power arrayed against her. "The truth doesn't need my voice to exist, doctor," she said. Her voice was still soft. It carried anyway. His smile was the smile of someone who had just realized he wasn't winning as decisively as he'd calculated. He turned and closed his office door with deliberate quietness, which was somehow more menacing than a slam. By Friday morning, before the captain arrived at Sacred Heart's Trauma Bay, Margaret's transfer paperwork appeared in the system. Rural clinic 200 miles north, Cascade Falls, position starting Monday at 7 a.m. 72 hours to pack. 72 hours to disappear from Portland. 72 hours before she was too far away to recognize patterns, verify outcomes, or expose whatever Dr. Ashford was truly doing with those experimental procedures that bore the signature of something dark and carefully hidden. She understood then that he'd never been trying to break her. He'd been trying to exile her. And he'd succeeded. But that wasn't the worst part. That Friday night, at 11:11 p.m., the radio crackled in the ER bay, and everything that Dr. Ashford had so carefully arranged began to collapse under the weight of a single patient who would arrive on a stretcher with a dog tag on a broken chain and the kind of injuries that only someone like Margaret could recognize for what they truly were. The radio crackled at 11:08 p.m. Code blue, inbound, ETA for minutes. Training accident, chest trauma, both trauma surgeons unavailable, one locked in OR with a femoral artery repair that couldn't be stopped, one unreachable somewhere in the city with his phone on silent. The ER charge nurse looked at the residents. Nobody moved. The space where decisions happened had suddenly opened up and nobody wanted to fall into it. In the hallway outside radiology, Dr. Ashford stood with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and measured. I understand the rural clinic's position, but the paperwork needs to move faster. 24 hours, not 72. She becomes someone else's problem by tomorrow morning. He listened. His jaw tightened. Then make it happen. Call the administrator. She's a liability and I need her gone before she contaminates anyone else's chart. He hung up and turned back toward the ER bay, his expression already composed, already wearing the concerned physician's mask. Margaret was restocking the crash cart on the second-floor medical unit when dispatch came through the overhead speaker. She moved on instinct. Code carts didn't restock themselves, and Friday nights meant every set of hands would matter. Her fingers worked through the familiar inventory, syringes, airways, the blue trauma shears clipped to her pocket. She heard the ambulance bay doors open 2 floors below, heard the controlled urgency that meant something bad was coming in hot. She grabbed the crash cart and moved toward the stairwell, but the radio crackled again with the paramedic report. Training accident, crushed chest, specific bleed pattern they couldn't control in the field. Margaret's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. That bleed pattern. Subclavian artery, partial compression, the kind of injury she'd seen once before in a concrete room 8,000 miles away where a 20-year-old SEAL lay bleeding into his chest cavity while Margaret held his vessel together with her fingers because there was no surgery available, no surgeon coming, just a field hospital that officially didn't exist and a young man who couldn't be officially acknowledged if he died. The crash cart wheel squeaked against the tile as she pushed it toward the stairwell. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Down 1 flight, then another, her boots hitting each step with precise rhythm, a habit from years of moving through military compounds where your footfalls broadcast your discipline to everyone listening. The ER bay was chaos dressed as control. 2 residents barking orders that didn't connect to anything. A nurse standing with her hands half raised, waiting for a command structure that hadn't materialized. The ambulance crew was already transferring, a man in his mid-40s, barrel chest, the kind of build that came from decades of specialized fitness, his uniform torn away and his ribs exposed and 1 single dog tag hanging from a broken chain around his neck. Margaret saw that dog tag and saw her husband's face. She saw the bleed pattern and saw the field hospital in Bagram. The memories compressed into a single point of certainty. This man was going to die in the next 3 minutes unless someone with her specific knowledge did something no resident in this hospital had been trained to do. She didn't think. Thinking was for people with options. Get me a chest tray. Her voice came out low and flat, the tone she'd learned years ago when orders needed to move air, not sound. 2 units O negative, push them through. And close that door. The resident nearest to her looked up, confused by the authority that had no visible source. Margaret was already moving to the captain's side, her hands already reading his chest the way a musician reads sheet music, pressure here, tension there, the specific architecture of trauma that only became visible once you'd held it together with your own fingers. The subclavian artery was compressed but not fully severed. If she didn't touch it, the pressure would build and the vessel would rupture and he'd bleed out in minutes. If she touched it wrong, her pressure would rupture it faster. The window was a needle's eye and she'd threaded it before, once, in a place that officially never happened. Move. She nodded to the resident. He stepped back without argument, because command doesn't ask twice and Margaret's entire body was broadcasting a rank that her scrubs didn't list. She positioned herself beside the captain's chest, her left hand, the steady hand, the hand that had held lives together through fire support and sandstorms and the kind of silence that only exists in places where dying men can't scream, and she found the exact pressure point where the artery needed to be held. Her fingers slipped into place, first 2 fingers, applying pressure at the angle she'd practiced in her mind for 18 years, the angle between life and death that you only get one chance to calculate. The captain's eyes rolled back. Shock was coming fast, his body recognizing the trauma faster than his brain could process it. Margaret leaned close to his face, her voice dropping into the register she'd used for dying operators in that field hospital, the voice that belonged to someone who'd learned how to hold people together when every system in their body was failing. "Captain, you're going into shock, but I've got you. I need you to focus on my voice." Her fingers held steady. "Tell me your boat name. Tell me your crew. Stay with me." His lips moved. The words barely formed a name, a unit designation, the kind of specific detail that a SEAL would anchor himself to when everything else was trying to drift away. Margaret kept her hand in position and kept talking, one voice speaking to one drowning man in a hospital room while the rest of the world tried to function around them. The resident returned with the chest tray, with the 2 units of O negative that moved like syrup through the fall line. Margaret couldn't take her hand to manage the transfusion, so she called it out and the resident moved with the kind of precision that comes from watching someone who knows exactly what they're doing. 1 hour passed. Her hand didn't move. 2 hours. 3. The skin of her fingertips began to lose sensation, but she didn't adjust her position by millimeters because adjustment meant death and she didn't do death, not anymore, not here, not him. The captain's eyes were open now, tracking her face. She talked him through the shock the way she'd talked others through it, counting his breaths, narrating his vital signs like a story where he stayed conscious and stayed alive. For hours. 5. Her fingers had gone completely numb, but she could still feel the pulse beneath them, the vessel holding, the pressure exactly balanced between keeping him alive and crushing the artery flat. She improvised a chest seal from MRE packaging she kept in her locker, a technique that didn't exist in any civilian protocol, that had been born in a field hospital 8,000 miles away where protocols didn't matter because there were no protocols when the official position was that nothing was happening. She jury-rigged it with the resident's help, maintaining pressure with her left hand while her right hand moved with practiced efficiency. Her movements were water, were air, were the kind of seamless economy of motion that only comes from having done this before when the cost of inefficiency was a dead seal and a body that couldn't be officially recovered. 6 hours. The captain's vitals stabilized. His color returned from gray to something approximating flesh. 7 hours. Margaret's uniform was soaked through with his sweat and her own, and her left arm was trembling not from fear but from 8 hours of isometric pressure without relief. That's when Dr. Ashford walked past the trauma bay window. He stopped. His face went white, then red, the kind of color a man's face turns when he realizes that his careful arrangements have just become irrelevant. He turned and walked away. 15 minutes later he returned with security, his phone still in his hand from whatever calls he'd made, from whatever attempts he'd launched to accelerate Margaret's disappearance from this hospital before she could do what she'd just done, save a patient using knowledge that shouldn't exist outside a black site. Hour 8. The captain's breathing had stabilized to the point where a resident could take position, could hold the pressure while Margaret removed her hand. She withdrew slowly, carefully, watching the resident's fingers settle into the exact angle, watching the captain's vitals remain stable as a new set of hands became responsible for his life. Only then did Margaret step back. Dr. Ashford was already waiting, already holding a folder that had been prepared in advance, already wearing the expression of a man executing a plan that had been set in motion before this patient had even arrived. The security guards flanked him like bookends. "Nurse Walsh, you've performed physician-level procedures without oversight, violated protocol, and exceeded your scope of practice." His voice was precise, controlled, the voice of a man reading from a script he'd written hours ago. "Security will escort you from the building immediately. Your termination is effective immediately, and I'm launching a full investigation into your fraudulent credentials." Margaret didn't speak. She never did when there was nothing to say, when the truth was already standing in the room wearing a dog tag on a broken chain and still breathing, still alive, still someone's son or brother or crew member who would wake up tomorrow and remember her face before he remembered anything else. She pulled off her gloves, the motion was final, was closing, was the sound of latex snapping like a period at the end of a sentence, and followed the security guards through the ER bay. The night staff watched her pass. No one moved. No one spoke. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their mechanical song, and Margaret understood in that moment that this was the cost of stepping back into the light, the cost of using the skills that she'd buried under 3 years of invisibility. She'd tried to stay hidden like they'd ordered, but she couldn't watch him destroy people, and now she'd surfaced for nothing. The captain's eyes opened at 6:22 a.m. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, the ventilator's mechanical breathing synchronized with his own, oxygen saturation holding at 94%. The Navy medical team arrived 12 minutes later, 3 officers in dress uniforms moving through Sacred Heart's trauma bay with the quiet authority of people accustomed to giving orders and receiving answers. They asked one question: who performed the advanced combat surgical hold? Who kept him alive through the night? The trauma nurses pointed toward the chart. Margaret Walsh. Nobody seemed to know anything else about her except her name, which meant nobody was looking deep enough, which meant Dr. Ashford had maybe 6 hours before someone started asking the right questions. He found her in the supply closet restocking 4 kits, her hospital badge still clipped to her scrubs, her hands moving with mechanical precision. His voice was ice: "You violated protocol. You treated a patient without physician oversight. You performed a procedure you have no authorization to perform." She didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. She simply finished placing the last 4 kit on the shelf and turned to face him, and in that moment Dr. Ashford saw something in her eyes that made the air in the closet feel suddenly thin. It was the look of someone who had seen worse things than him, survived worse things than him, and wasn't even slightly intimidated by his authority. He'd spent 3 years building an empire out of fear and institutional power. She'd spent 8 hours saving a life using skills he couldn't even comprehend. The contrast was not lost on him. "Security is waiting," he said. "You're escorted from the building effective immediately. Your termination is finalized. Don't make this difficult." She nodded once. Calm as standing water. The 2 security officers were already moving toward her when Dr. Ashford's phone buzzed, a text from his attorney confirming that the investigation into Margaret's fraudulent credentials had been filed with the State Nursing Board, the Hospital Ethics Committee, and the FBI. Every agency that mattered. Every official channel that could bury a person so deep they'd never surface again. He'd prepared the paperwork 24 hours in advance, which meant he'd anticipated this, which meant he'd planned to destroy her the moment she tried to help that captain. The walk from Sacred Heart's doors to the employee parking lot took 7 minutes. Margaret moved between the security officers like a prisoner of war walking toward extraction, shoulders back, head level, not looking left or right. One of the officers, a younger man named Derek who'd always nodded to her in the hallways, wouldn't meet her eyes. The rain had started again, Portland's endless October drizzle, the kind that soaked everything slowly, without drama, without mercy. By the time she reached her car, her scrubs were damp enough to cling to her ribs, and her hospital badge felt like a stone around her neck. She drove north through the city, the windshield wiper squeaking in rhythm with her heartbeat. Not toward home. Not toward anywhere that made sense. Her hands knew the route anyway, they'd taken it 100 times over the past 3 years, always at dawn, always alone. The veteran cemetery sat in Section 12, 3 miles outside Portland, 200 graves arranged in precise rows like soldiers standing at attention even in death. The rain hammered the windshield like someone demanding entry. She parked, left her badge on the seat, walked through mud that pulled at her shoes with every step. David Walsh's headstone was simple: name, rank, dates, and a lie. Training accident, 2016. Not Bagram. Not a black site hospital with casualties that couldn't be counted because they'd never been authorized to exist in the first place. Not the same operation that had erased Margaret's records and classified her into a ghost. Just training accident, the official story for people who died in places the government preferred not to remember. She knelt in the mud. Rain soaked through her scrubs, through her skin, into the places where she stored her grief like ammunition. Her voice came out broken. I tried to stay hidden like they ordered, David. I tried so hard. But I couldn't watch him destroy people the way they destroyed us, and now I've surfaced for nothing. Her hands touched the headstone, traced his name with trembling fingers that had held his hand while he died in a field hospital tent, that had performed CPR on his chest for 40 minutes after the doctors declared him unsalvageable, that had let him go because staying meant getting both of them erased. I failed him. That captain will never know who saved him. They'll bury my name so deep there won't even be a stone. She stayed there until the rain intensified, until her phone went dead, until the morning light turned the cemetery into a watercolor painting of grief. When she finally drove back to her apartment in northeast Portland, her hands were numb. The steering wheel felt like ice under her palms. Her mailbox contained 3 letters, each one a door closing. The first was from the State Nursing Board, investigation initiated for credential fraud. The second was from Sacred Heart's Ethics Committee, investigation initiated for practicing medicine without licensure. The third was from the FBI, investigation initiated for falsifying federal employment documents. Every agency working in concert. Every official channel moving like a carefully choreographed operation designed to destroy one person completely. Dr. Ashford hadn't just fired her. He'd prepared to erase her. Her apartment was small, a 1-bedroom in a building where nobody asked questions, where the landlord accepted cash, where Margaret had built a life that was designed to be forgotten. She began packing. Her clothes first, folded methodically into boxes. Her books into bags. The photographs came down from the walls, her wedding picture with David in dress blues, Danny's school photos from 1st grade and 4th grade, nothing military because officially those years didn't exist. Nothing that proved she'd been a major, a combat surgeon, a legend in operations that never happened. At 3:14 p.m., footsteps thundered up the stairwell. Heavy. Fast. Desperate. Danny burst through the apartment door holding a locked metal box, his face streaked with tears, his voice shaking in a way that made Margaret's chest constrict. Mom, I know you said never to open this. I know you made me promise. But they fired you. They fired you for saving someone's life. That's not right. That's not. He stopped, breathing hard, holding the box like it was made of lead. Everyone needs to see what's inside. Everyone needs to know. Margaret's hands rose slowly, as if she could stop time with her palms. Danny, no. Close it. Put it away. Mom. One word. The word of a 16-year-old boy who'd grown up watching his mother hide, watching her take insults, watching her erase herself one day at a time. You're my mother. You deserve better than this. He opened the box. Inside, a medal frame mounted with 4 decorations in ascending order of prestige, each ribbon a different color, each one representing an operation she'd never been allowed to discuss. Citations in sealed envelopes stamped with federal classification markings. A photograph of her in uniform at age 32, her rank insignia visible on her collar, her eyes holding the kind of hardness that only comes from saving lives in places where death was running the show. A folded flag from her husband's ceremony. Margaret sank onto the edge of the couch. She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. The timeline had just accelerated beyond her control, and every choice she'd made to stay hidden was now about to become public record. Danny Walsh stood in the doorway of his mother's apartment with rain still dripping from his jacket, his hand shaking as he held the lockbox she'd forbidden him to open since he was 12 years old. His face was streaked with tears, not from sadness but from rage, the kind of rage that only comes when a child realizes his mother's sacrifice has been weaponized against her. The box was heavy, military-grade steel with a combination lock she'd changed 3 times. He'd cracked it anyway. 16-year-old persistence and a YouTube video on lockpicking. He set it down on the kitchen table like it was made of glass. "Mom, they fired you for saving someone's life," he said, his voice steady in the way hers had taught him to be. "They need to see these." Margaret stared at the lockbox without moving. 37 seconds passed. She could hear the rain on the roof, could hear the fluorescent hum of the apartment's kitchen light, could hear Danny's breathing, controlled, military-grade breathing, the kind she'd taught him on his 5th birthday when his father had deployed. She opened the box. Inside, nestled in velvet and shadow, 7 medals arranged in order of precedence. Bronze Star with Valor. 2 Purple Hearts. A Distinguished Service Cross. A Defense Superior Service Medal. Dog tags. Citations. Photographs from Bagram dated 18 years ago. Her face, younger, hand-stained with blood that wasn't hers, standing with 8 operators whose names were redacted but whose eyes she still saw every night. "Don't," Margaret whispered. "I'm done protecting your secrets," Danny said. "They're protecting the wrong people." Monday morning came with the weight of finality. Margaret and Danny walked into Sacred Heart's administrative hearing room at exactly 9 a.m., and Margaret was wearing something she hadn't worn in 18 years, her dress uniform. Navy dress whites with ribbons arranged by regulation. The frame in Danny's hands held the Bronze Star, the 2 Purple Hearts, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Defense Superior Service Medal, each one visible, each one real, each one a moment she'd spent 2 decades trying to bury. The hospital board chairman's pen stopped moving mid-sentence. The Navy liaison, a full commander whose name tag read Hayes, stood up so slowly his chair scraped the tile floor like a siren. His face went pale the way soldiers' faces do when they recognize rank they didn't know was in the room. 3 words came out of his mouth, barely audible. "Major." The room went silent. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of understanding. The silence of people realizing they'd been speaking casually to someone who had been trained in classified locations to do things governments couldn't acknowledge. A nurse from the review board, Diane, the one who'd been kind to Margaret at the coffee station 3 years ago, picked up Margaret's file with trembling hands. Her fingers left small damp marks on the paper. She read aloud, her voice cracking on words she didn't fully understand. Bagram Field Hospital. 18 months, 2006 to 2007. Surgical technician, rotating rotation. Unprecedented survival rates, 94.7% of critical trauma cases recovered full mobility. Decorated for exceptional valor under fire, November 14, 2006. Decorated again, March 3, 2007. Classified operational involvement, redacted, redacted, redacted. Top secret security clearance maintained through 2014. Honorable discharge, rank major, commended for service that remains classified. Diane looked up. Her eyes were wet. "You work black site hospitals." Margaret didn't respond. Composure. Control. The room itself seemed to be holding its breath. Then the doors opened, and the Navy captain walked in. He wasn't limping anymore. The man she'd spent 8 hours holding together, talking through shock like a meditation, his body a collapsed structure that she'd shored up with her bare hands and surgical knowledge that wasn't supposed to exist in a civilian hospital. He walked in flanked by a SEAL team leader whose shoulder bears carried the weight of command like other men carry briefcases. The SEAL team leader's voice was sandpaper and gravel. "I'm Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Graves, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse. This is Captain James Mitchell, Navy. He asked me to be here." Chief Graves stepped forward and held up a framed set of citations. One at a time, he named them. Bronze Star with Valor. 2 Purple Hearts. Distinguished Service Cross for holding a trauma bay alone during a 12-hour siege in Kandahar Province, 2009. Defense Superior Service Medal for a mission I cannot describe in this room. He looked directly at the hospital board chairman. This woman saved his life. 8 hours. Black site surgical technique she wasn't supposed to know, performed on a patient who would have died with any standard procedure. She violated your protocols. She violated your chain of command. She violated your hospital policy. And if she hadn't, Captain Mitchell would be in Arlington Cemetery right now, not standing in your hearing room. Chief Graves placed the frame on the table with the precision of a man placing explosives. You fired her for this. An FBI agent who'd been sitting in the back corner cleared his throat. Special Agent Morrison, the investigation had started with fraud allegations against Margaret. It had become something else. Something much larger. This investigation has expanded, he said flatly. We're now looking at 29 surgical cases. 29 patients who received what Dr. Ashford called experimental dual clamp vascular technique. 3 of them have suffered permanent complications consistent with the exact procedure failure I've documented in black site records from Bagram, 2006. Medical records I obtained from the Department of Defense this morning. Records that show this technique failed on civilians whose physiology couldn't tolerate vascular stress that soldiers in peak condition might survive. The agent opened his laptop. Dr. Ashford's file is being accessed by State Medical Board investigators as we speak. He's being arrested at his home this afternoon on charges of medical malpractice, fraud, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy to cover up patient deaths. The hospital board chairman's mouth opened and closed without sound. A fish suffocating in air. The fraudulent credentials investigation, Agent Morrison continued, was a weaponized complaint filed by Dr. Ashford himself against the one person who could identify his experimental procedures. He attempted to destroy her credibility before she could expose him. That investigation is now closed. Major Margaret Walsh's military record has been partially declassified as of this morning. She is not a fraud. She is exactly what her credentials claim, a combat surgeon with 18 years of classified service, 2 Purple Hearts, and a track record of impossible survival rates. Danny's hand found Margaret's shoulder. She didn't flinch. She never flinched. But her hand rose to touch his, the first gesture of anything other than composure she'd made since they entered the room. The hospital will be issuing a formal apology and reinstating you effective immediately, the board chairman said, his words sliding out like ice from a broken freezer. With full back pay. And we'd like to discuss a new position. Director of Trauma Services. Developing a combat medicine training program. Margaret's eyes moved to Captain Mitchell's face. He was smiling. The kind of smile that comes from standing on the other side of impossible and knowing who pulled you through. She took the position. 3 surgical patients came forward by Tuesday. 1 described permanent nerve damage. Another, reduced grip strength that ended his career as a carpenter. A third wept quietly in a follow-up appointment and said, I knew something was wrong. I knew it wasn't supposed to feel like that. By Wednesday, the State Medical Board opened a formal inquiry. By Thursday, Dr. Ashford's attorney attempted to negotiate, claiming experimental techniques were cutting-edge research, claiming Margaret's military background made her biased, claiming the patients would have died anyway. The negotiations lasted 14 minutes before Agent Morrison placed subpoenas on every operating room record, every surgical note, every patient file from the past 8 years. By Friday, the investigation encompassed 41 cases. 6 months later, Margaret arrived at Sacred Heart at 6 a.m. wearing her uniform because Commander Hayes had asked her to for a ceremony honoring the captain she'd saved. The morning air smelled like rain and fresh asphalt, the kind of morning that feels like transition. She walked through the lobby with Danny, now 17 and talking about pre-med programs with the casual confidence of someone who'd learned where strength actually comes from. That's when she saw Dr. Ashford. He was wearing a security guard uniform. Night shift, graveyard hours, the same shift she'd once worked. His medical license was revoked. His trial was pending. He was mopping the lobby floor where he used to walk as chief of medicine, where he'd orchestrated the invisible campaign that was supposed to erase her. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. Margaret didn't slow her pace. She didn't speak. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply continued toward the elevator with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that darkness could offer. Upstairs, she entered the Trauma Simulation Center, a new facility funded by Navy grant money, with equipment that hummed like a living thing. 25 nurses filled the room. Day shift, night shift, veterans, new graduates. Hands that had learned kindness by watching someone who knew how to hold life together in the dark. Margaret placed David's wedding ring on the table beside the single dog tag on the broken chain, the one the captain had given her as thanks. She looked at the nurses' faces. Young faces. Strong faces. Faces that hadn't yet learned what it felt like to watch someone die in your arms and carry that weight alone. Combat medicine isn't about having more tools, Margaret began, her voice dropping an octave, the voice transformation complete. It's about making impossible choices in the dark and living with them. It's about knowing your hands might be the last thing someone feels before they find peace. You're not just learning procedure. You're learning to carry weight that nobody will ever acknowledge. To hold the line when the line is just you, alone, at 2 a.m., with someone's life balanced on what you do next. This is what they taught me at Bagram. This is what I'm teaching you now. She walked them through the pressure point technique. The improvised chest seal from MRE packaging. The way to talk someone through shock when all you have is your voice, steady, measured, certain, even when certainty is a lie you're telling to keep them alive. After class, Commander Hayes presented her with a flag flown over Bagram in her honor. The captain she'd saved stood in the back, watching. He was wearing his dress uniform. His medals caught the light like promises kept. That evening, Margaret drove to the Veterans Cemetery in Portland. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing. She knelt at David's grave and whispered, "I surfaced. I stayed. And it mattered." On her way out, she passed a new bench. Bronze plaque. In honor of Major Margaret Walsh, heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. She sat on that bench for 17 minutes. She didn't cry. Composure. Control. But her hand traced the letters, and for the first time in 18 years, the weight she'd been carrying didn't feel quite so alone. Margaret's combat medicine program became a model for trauma training facilities nationwide. 42 hospitals adopted her framework. 237 nurses trained in her methods. In the first 18 months, 7 lives were saved using the improvised techniques she'd taught. 7 people who walked out of emergency rooms because someone had learned from her that heroism sometimes looks like a quiet nurse teaching others to hold the line. That's the story they don't tell you. The ones where the hero never gets famous. Where victory looks like training the next generation to survive the impossible. Where standing in the dark and helping someone breathe is enough. If you've been with us before, welcome back, hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here, please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.